Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is going to be an educational one, so feel free to grab a pen and paper and take notes. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll understand a little bit more about the formats and word count ranges for novels, novellas, novelettes, short stories, and maybe even flash fiction. When we talk about storytelling, we're often referring to things that everybody's already very familiar with, such as characters, setting, conflict, plot, those types of things. But there's another piece of that puzzle that young or aspiring writers, or new writers, often overlook, and that's the format in which they tell the story. When I say format, I don't mean pen and paper, word processor, typewriter. I mean the package in which the story is told. Is it a novel? Is it a novella? Is it a short story? That's what I mean by format. So if you've ever read a book, maybe you've gotten towards the end of it, or even the middle of it, and you think to yourself, this story could have trimmed 20 or 30,000 words and nothing important would have been lost. If you've ever had that thought, then you know how important it is to choose the right format for your story. I hate to say this, guys, because a lot of people, a lot of aspiring writers believe that they have a novel inside of them that's just begging to come out. So unfortunately, because of that thinking, a lot of people believe that novel is the default format, but it's not the only format. It's my preferred format for sure, but that doesn't mean that you can't write a shorter book and still tell an amazing story. Let's start with the basics. Every single storytelling format has a word count range, and within this range there are averages. You might think of word count ranges as generations, right? There's usually a lot of debate around where they overlap. Whether you're a boomer or a Gen X or a millennial, it gets a little fuzzy sometimes when you're transitioning from one generation to the next. And we have the same problem with formats and word count ranges sometimes. Depending on where you fall, it might be a novella, it might be a novel, who really knows? And because it's not already confusing enough, we're going to add genre into that mix, because genres, of course, have their own word count preferences, with genres like fantasy and science fiction tending to be a little bit on the heavier, longer side, and romance novels and western tending to be a little on the lighter side. I don't want to confuse you guys too early, so we're just going to ignore genre altogether for a second and focus on word count ranges. The average novel tends to be around 80,000 words. However, the range for novels can be anywhere from 60,000 to 100,000 words, or even a little bit over 100,000. They can even go as low as 40,000, but I have to warn you, at 40,000 words, a lot of agents and editors will tell you that is too short. It's almost in novella territory at that point, but we're not quite there yet, so stay with me. While shorter novels do fit better on a bookstore shelf if you're going the print route, sometimes if they're too short, they won't be picked up simply because it's not as cost effective to print them. And also too, a lot of editors will tell you that there's just not enough story there. You need to bulk it up a little bit. There needs to be more world building, more characterization, perhaps more tension or conflict. So just be mindful of that. Personally, I would even say go for 70,000 if you can, because that'll still give you a little bit of wiggle room if you need to bulk up a chapter or two, or if you have any extraneous scenes that have too much dialogue or too much exposition, you can cut it down and you won't be at risk of losing any vital information. Now, just tying genre back into this very quickly, if you are writing a specific genre for a specific audience, you really do have to be mindful of that word count range and try to stay within it, because the reality is, readers who are loyal to one genre or another will have expectations, and you just want to make sure you meet those expectations. If you're under that 60,000 word threshold that qualifies a book as a novel, that's fine. You are now officially in novella territory, and novellas are a great way to tell a story, especially companion stories. If you've already written a book, you've already set up that world, but you want to just sort of have a spin-off series with some side characters or whatever, novellas are such an excellent vehicle for this, because chances are your readers already know how your world works. They've already been introduced to everybody. They typically range from 17,500 to about 40,000 words, which I know that gives you about a 20,000 word discrepancy, but remember, we're talking about hazy overlaps here, right? But generally speaking, if you're around 30,000 words. That's kind of the average for novellas. These lighter stories can still pack a really powerful punch in the market, especially because they are very favorable for chapter books and middle grade novels. Remember, middle grade is for kids between 9 and 12 years old. I don't know about you, but when I was 9, I was not really in a mood to read an 80,000 word novel, even though I was a very voracious reader. But again, knowing your audience, this is so crucial. I will continue to say it because it is so vitally important to know your audience, your genre, and the story you're telling. Now there's another format that's even shorter than the novella, and that's the novelette. The novelette is kind of tucked in between short story and novella. They're usually between 7,500 and 17,500 words. I know a lot of 7s, a lot of 5s there, but they're longer than short stories, and they're shorter than novellas. So they present a very unique problem in that, where do you sell them? Generally speaking, too short to fit on a brick-and-mortar bookstore shelf, and they're too long for e-zines, literary magazines, anthologies, etc. Again, if you're going the traditional route, you might encounter some challenges pitching this particular format simply because it is a weird in-between size. Have you ever gone clothes shopping and you're too big for the small, but you're too small for the medium? Congratulations, you know what it feels like to be a novelette now. Which brings me to short stories. One common misconception that I've heard a lot over the years is, if you want to write novels, start by writing short stories. And I think this is a really well-intentioned piece of advice, but it's often misguided, because the reality is short stories and novels obey completely different rules in terms of how the stories are written. Story opens, that is your introduction. You move through to the inciting incident, that's basically the tip-off for the main conflict. And then as you move towards that conflict or climax, you have your rising action. Right? It's like a hill or a mountain. And then you get to the very top of that mountain, and that's the climax. That is the peak of all the action. Your character is just pushed to the breaking point. And then whatever happens, whether it's a war or some terrible incident like a shooting or something like that, something really bad happens to test your character's mettle. That's your climax. But somehow they get through. Now that's the falling action. Now they're coming out of that storm. They're wiping the sweat off their brow. They're kind of emerging from that haze, from all the confusion and the conflict. Back down to the resolution and the conclusion. So you may have smaller blips in that timeline, but generally speaking, you will have a very distinct curve. And that's more or less what the meat and bones of your plot is. Short stories don't have the luxury of that very long timeline. Okay, they're very short. They're between 1,000 and 7,500 words. That's not a lot of time. So they have to start pretty much right in the climax. They have to start at if not the inciting incident, then right after it happens. So with so few words to work with, you've got to make them count. You can't spend a whole lot of time on characterization or world building, but don't overlook those steps because they're very critical as well. And now, since we're clearly on a bit of a theme here about size, now you're thinking, Jess, there's no way you can go shorter than a short story, right? Wrong. You can't go shorter than a short story. You can do flash fiction, which is 100 words or less. And now you're thinking, no, there's no way, we can't make it shorter. Now you have a 6-word story. Pretty self-explanatory, right? A rather famous example is one by Ernest Hemingway. For Sale, Baby Shoes Never Worn. The emotion is there, the story is there, not a whole lot of world building, but it leaves something up to the imagination. Anyway guys, thanks for joining me for another video. As always, I'm Jess, and I will catch you guys on the next one. Take care.